Hi, Misha here, and yeah, we're finally doing another aircraft video. To be fair, this summer I've been pretty taken up with work and the cabin project, and really have been trying to avoid buying toys and things, models as much as possible. However, this one I pre-ordered at the end of last year, beginning of this year, and it's pretty cool and something you don't see, and it's a Corgi. Yeah, they're still around. And this is a tooling that seems criminally underutilized by them. In fact, this is maybe the only 9th or 10th issue of this over the last 20 years. I was going to say British, but this is actually Australian, English Electric, or in this case, GAF, Canberra bomber. And I'm just going to focus in on this variant for the video, but if you like it and it gets enough views, I'll do another one looking at, say, the Martin B57 and the British RAF B2, B6, B8 Canberras themselves. What a neat jet. I like first generation jets, and at the day and time this was considered a medium bomber, although by more modern standards it really could be considered almost a fighter bomber in a way. And its roots actually go all the way back to World War II, and Australia is really interesting because it's really the biggest combat user of the Canberra, and it's even named for the Australian city. So let's just talk about it. Why not? Of course, this is 1/72 scale diecast. And again, if you do want more of these, let me know, because setting up for these model videos takes as long as anything else, and sometimes it's just a little discouraging unless I get a lot of feedback, guys, so it does help. Let's dive in. Even though these actually come with a pretty good stand, it's metal, although I wish it had a metal base instead of plastic. Even the top is metal with rubber bumpers. I'm gonna take it off and put it on the spinny thing, just in case something somewhere goes out of balance, guys. I don't want to risk dropping it. And as far as I know, this is the first time Corgi has done a Canberra in RAAF, Australian Air Force colors and service. And this one's from number 2 Squadron, Vietnam. They were stationed there for roughly 4 years, and actually had quite an illustrious combat record, and serving alongside the U.S. Air Force 35th. But let's go back a bit. I'm not going to go too much into Canberra history here, though you can do that in the British video, but let's hit the high points. World War II, the Mosquito. Interesting development in bomber technology, meant to be fast and 2-seater. Yeah, needed a replacement jet engine. Like it's English Electric involved, who really wasn't an aircraft designer up at this point, although they were making bombers for the war effort, because everyone was making something for the war in the UK and Australia. And eventually this would result in a contract. Pretty much the very earliest medium jet bomber designs came right after the war in 1945, and a contract for 4 prototypes was signed in 46, but post-war cutbacks meant that, it was slow going in the UK, and they actually switched from 1 engine to 2, and they weren't even sure which Rolls Royce they would go with. They were hoping for the Avon, but there were contingency plans. But the original A1, then the B1 as it was known, would lead to the B2, which is the full production version. Around 1949, the RAF would get interested, and they would get it officially adopted, and then 50-51 you'd see the introduction and of the first test flights of the improved B2 bomber version and deliveries, and it would be in service in time for at least the latter half of the Korean War, and would actually serve in the UK through the second, not the first, war in Iraq, and even in Afghanistan, not being fully retired, at least some versions, until 2006. And while English Electric was the primary builder contractor, there were several other companies and contractors used, and they would build over 900 there with several marks and variations. And it would serve in 27 nations in total, including Australia. During the Second World War, the RAAF, Australian Air Force, was actually very important in the war against Japan, and they primarily flew British-designed bombers, including the Lancaster, actually one of the coolest from the war, and they had an active bomber force of over 250. But after the war, they decided to restructure, reevaluate, and by 1946-47, they decided to go with a new strategy, a much smaller bomber force, but that was more flexible, more versatile, and that used newer cutting-edge technology, at least as much as they could budget for. So what to do? Now, they were flying the Lincoln, at least some of the time, in place of the Lancaster after the war. And they did look at a wholly domestic design. But by 1948, they thought, no, we're going to get a foreign design, but then build it domestically. It just made a lot of sense for them. It would improve their own aviation industry and give them some autonomy. And it was going to be a much smaller force. And by 1949, the Canberra here, as it would soon be known, was kind of entering advanced development stages. We had 5-6 prototypes. The B2 prototype was just coming out. And one of the key differences with the B2 from the B1, the B1 is just meant to be a two-seater, pilot and navigator with an automatic, at least for the day and time, bombing system. But it just wasn't going to be ready yet. It was a bridge too far. So with the B2, they went to a glass nose, or plexiglass, and a bombardier was added. So you had a total of 3 seats: pilot, navigator, and bombardier. And this is in the British version. Throughout the year 1949, the Australians looked at it. By August, funding was pretty much unlocked for it, including license negotiations, which took a little while with the British because the Australians thought they were charging a little much. Doesn't matter. The point is, by 1950, things are underway. So officially, the director of English Electric calls this the Canberra early on that year, and then roughly a year later, the Prime Minister of Australia also accepts the name. So that's kind of where it comes from. And the plan was for Australia to build under license, including the Avon Mark 1 engine, 48 aircraft, 41 bombers, and 7 trainers, dual control aircraft. And these were to be built between 1952 and 1955, replacing the older Lincolns and just letting them scale down from a force of over 250 to under 50. And of course, far fewer crew in these versus the Lancasters and Lincolns, which were 6-7 crew members. And this would not have guns. Instead, it was to rely on its speed and originally high altitude bombing. Later that would change with the lab system. We'll get there. A lot of things were changing as the Korean War is about to kick off. But by 1951, things are finally underway, although they won't exactly go to schedule or plan. Picking this up, it's quite a heavy model. It's mostly metal, including the bomb doors. And this is a Mark 20. Now, I mentioned the B2. Essentially, this is a B2 modified to Australian specifications, including having more fuel tankage in the wings, different edge to the wings, a different starter system. Well, it was still a cartridge starter, but whereas the British engines only had 1, this could hold 3, although in practice that wasn't as good as they hoped. And overall, the same thing. Originally, this had the Avon Mark 1 engine. Later on, it would go to the Mark 109, which would give better performance, especially in tropical environments. There were a lot of other small changes, and this really did push the Australian aviation industry forward. And they were worried about manufacturing the wing, because this was pretty much an all-metal aircraft with only the tail being wood, or at least some wood. And you'll notice it's a pretty straight wing design. The designers at English Electric did consider a swept wing. They were aware of the benefits in speed at this point. But they decided in 1949-1950 that the improvement in agility, maneuverability with a straight wing, or at least mostly straight, was better than the added little bit of speed more of a swept wing would give. You might argue about that. As a default, it had no guns, and the Australian version would never have guns, although the British and Americans would actually put guns on some of their variants later on. And also the Australian version only had a crew of 2, pilot and navigator, who would double as the bombardier. To be fair, it was always kind of considered cramped inside because it was always meant to have 2, so the third guy was always a little bit crammed in there. He was right behind the pilot. And then if you had a bombardier, there was a third jump seat, folding seat to the right of the pilot. And then he would crawl through a tunnel to the nose to do the aiming, laying on his belly. I could understand why they thought, 2 was better. Training versions, known as the Mk.21 or T21 in Australia, would be set up a little bit differently. No guns, no early electronic countermeasures of any note, and it was considered a high-altitude, high-speed bomber for its day and time. It was capable of hitting about Mach 0.85 to 86, although in reality, bomb load and everything, that would drop to 0.8 or even 0.7, and it was capable of an altitude of roughly 48,000 feet. Good enough for the day and time. Overall, it was about 65.5 feet long and almost as wide at just at 64 feet wingspan, so very boxy, and I kind of love that look. And while from the get-go a photo reconnaissance version was planned, this was a bomber. And one thing that's kind of neat with the Corgi here is you do have hinged opening bomb doors, again made of metal. And you see there are 6 bombs in here. These are the 1,000-pounder variety. It could hold 9 500-pound bombs alternatively, or one really big 4,000-pounder. That was about its max limit. Now, one small thing, to open its bomb doors, it had to slow down. On the other hand, it was nuclear capable, although in the early 50s, the nukes that the UK had were too large to fit in here. Later on, ones would fit. And the Australian versions, even though they were always meant to be conventional, did retain the ability to carry a nuclear weapon if the need were ever to arise. They could put it in there. And of course, there was a photo reconnaissance version known as the Mark III or PR3. And the T4 Mark IV was the dual control trainer version, with the Mk.21 being the Aussie updated version. And there's one other kind of neat little thing that they did on the wingtips. Now, your early versions in Britain had fuel tanks on the wingtips, but as I said, they actually changed the wing to give more fuel inside, and that allows for a uniquely Aussie update of the Canberra. A single hard point in place of the tanks for a weapons rack, and I'm really happy Corgi included these, because they have a habit of not always including heavy armaments with their aircraft. Plus, it's just a small detail. Little 500-pound bomb here. I think they could carry up to 1,000 pounds on the tips, but I could be wrong. Again, it goes on the very extreme edge of the tip, which is kind of funny. But, a little extra carriage there. You have the 6 internal or 9 internal plus this. And, of course, the bomb aimer was in the nose. And let's put it back on the stand, but forgive me if I just make sure it doesn't tump over. Again, on a shelf, it's fine. It's just on this kind of slightly slanted forward and carpeted it's a little wiggly. But yeah, he would move from his navigator's position where he had an ejection seat, along with the pilot having his own, up here. And he would essentially use a pretty old school bombing sight, not very different from the Lancaster and Lincoln. So at least it was familiar, but it was just kind of old school. About the only modern thing he had was a Doppler radar to help estimate speed and kind of location a bit. So that helped, but not by much. And if he needed adjustments, it was old school. He would just call out to the pilot, left, right, whatever. Not really much automation. I've seen some sources say that the bombardier took over, only nominally, not physically. So, yeah, it worked, but keep in mind, it's just showing its World War II roots. Its jet engines were pretty good, though, at efficiency and everything, and could get it there. Had a range of 2,000 to 2,500 miles, kind of just depending on the load and the exact variation. And while the controls were just kind of manual, no autopilot or anything like that either, it seems to have been quite reliable and well liked by the crews, although many did complain, especially taller folks. It was a little cramped inside. But that was its kind of configuration for the Mk.20. And I think what's really neat about this Corgi, they just, even though they've only done 9 or 10 Canberras in total, one, they haven't done one of these brand new in over a decade. And two, most of the ones they've done in the past have not been armed up. There's been like the TT-18 target tow trainer. There was the Signals version. There was a trainer B6 they did, I remember. Even the American, the Martin B57 was the reconnaissance version. The only one that comes to mind right now with opening bomb bay and all that was the original release, which was from the Suez Crisis, RAF 1956. There's probably at least one more that I'm forgetting, but there you go. So that's why I'm so happy that not only does this one have a bomb bay with internal ordnance, it actually has the wingtip bombs as well. Pretty neat. So externally, the Mk.20 looks very similar to the B2, but internally, quite a bit different. So, what about service, deliveries, and all that to the RAAF and its use in not just Vietnam, but the Malayan emergency and a few other little things? Sorry guys, I did try it out on the spinny thing, but it was just too unstable. Yeah, sorry. One interesting thing about the Mk.20s, they were built with a lot of domestic parts. It wasn't like a British kit was sent over and they just assembled them at GAF or GAC, the government aircraft factory or corporation. But no, they sourced everything, including the Avon engines being manufactured domestically. Yeah, some parts appeared, including some from America, from Martin, but yeah. But they would have to wait, because the first two were entirely British. In August of 1951, an English Electric assembled B2 was delivered, and then in May of the following year, a second B2 was delivered. Now later on, these would actually be converted into Mk.21 or T-21 trainers, but in the beginning, they were there for like pattern aircraft and testing and familiarization for pilots and ground crews and the like. But no, domestic manufacturing was always the goal. So throughout 1952, they were tooling up, and they still planned to build 48 domestically. And the first, Australian-made Canberra would take to the skies on May 29, 1953, and be delivered to the Air Force that July, with subsequent models coming soon thereafter. It was put into initial operational service that December and would progress on from there. These were still the original Avon Mark I engine versions, which would continue throughout 1954. But then, at the beginning of 1955, there were some tropical tests, hot weather jungle environment testing. And they revealed a few things. Number one, the air conditioner sucked, at least for that area, Southeast Asia. Surprise, surprise, a bomber made for England and Northern Europe wasn't exactly well air conditioned. But also these engines, the original Mark 1s, weren't the best for that environment, especially with shorter runways. And that would ultimately lead to the Mark 109 being switched out in production. In fact, the last Mark 1 engine version would be made around October, November of that year, 55. And by the spring of the next year, the 109 would be the standard. And that would kind of be what would be happening going forward, plus some retrofits. And there were other small changes and improvements and whatnot. But for the most part, you just have the one version. Interesting. As I said at the beginning, this is from number 2 squadron, and they were one of 3 operational squadrons to fly the Canberra, and they were the first to switch over. They first started training up in November of 53 and reached a certain level of operational readiness by 54. In the summer of 1955, number 6 squadron would join them. And then finally, in the summer of 1958, number 1 squadron, the oldest Australian bomber squadron, would finally trade in their Lincolns and go to the new Canberra. Now, there would be other squadrons that use these, conversion training and some testing and evaluation. In fact, the list of squadrons is quite large, but those are the 3 combat. Although only 1 would actually go overseas, number 2 here. And their first foreign deployment would be a pretty big one, and a long one. Just as number 1 was switching over in the summer of 58, they would prepare to go over and respond to the Malayan emergency. Now, for years, there had been the Far East Air Force, including the UK, who was already operating Canberras there, responding to communist uprising and guerrilla movements and what have you. But now Australia is bringing their Canberras in as well. Again, still under British nominal authority, though. And they would actually fly quite a few missions for years, well into the 60s, over lots of nations, some for training, some for display, some for reconnaissance, probably a little bit of espionage too. And while they never saw direct combat, the Malayan emergency never went really hot. Not really, but they were there, and really got them some overseas experience. But it was only number 2 squadron, and I don't remember how many were actually stationed in that squadron. But in 1967, Vietnam would come to the outback. While Australian Army troops would support their American allies on the ground, the Australian Air Force would support the American Air Force in the air. Beginning in April of 1967, number 2 squad would station 8 Canberra Mark 20s in South Vietnam, nominally attached to the American 35th kind of operating. Now, because the Canberra, didn't have modern early warning systems, electronic warfare, no guns, wasn't the fastest in the world, it was stationed in pretty low-risk areas. In fact, it was never really sent to fly over North Vietnam, although it would get close a time or two. It would also kind of go near the Cambodian border. And they would actually drop quite a bit of ordnance, doing more than their part. What helped was this freed up American forces to hit the Ho Chi Minh, or Ho Chi Minh if you prefer, trail, and that's still doing very much their part. Incidentally, the Americans there were also flying a version of the Canberra, the B-57B, the updated Martin variant. They also had F-100 Super Sabres. Again, this is kind of early-ish on in the war, before the F-4 really takes over. Another fun fact, Early on, 67 into 68, Australian Canberras were actually dropping surplus leftover bombs from World War II, 500 and 1,000 pound mostly. But of course, as they'd use these up, they would go to newer ordnance like Snake Eyes and whatnot. But I don't know, I just kind of find that funny. But of course, with their electronics or lack thereof, they weren't really wired for anything fancy or even semi-smart by the standards of 1968. And they would drop considerable ordnance. By the way, this does actually come with a little clear piece if you want to have this propped open, otherwise they're just kind of hingy. Kind of wish they had detents to lock into with the bomb doors open, but oh well. They would fly mission after mission, day after day, and it's credited that they were 97% operational availability. They did maintenance around the clock. They really did put in their effort, and considering the hardware they were working with were quite accurate. By this point, a bomber that was originally meant to operate high was operating very much low altitude and trying to do pinpoint, and as they went to newer ordnance, this allowed them to be a little more effective. And of course, training and skill and practice and all that. And so they very much worked their asses off for a number of years. But as always, there was a cost. Every single Air Force loses aircraft to accidents and what have you, failures. And this had already happened more than once to the Australian Canberra fleet. But the first actual operational combat loss would come in November of 1970, when one of these was just lost. In fact, no one really knew how it was shot down for decades. The crew wasn't recovered until, I think, 2009, 2010. So it was lost with both crew members, and that was that. That was the first shoot down. March of the next year, 1971, another would be lost. This time to a SAM, surface-to-air missile, and we know this because the crew did safely eject and was safely recovered, so they could report back. These were the two combat losses to the force of 8 Australian Canberras in Vietnam. Now keep in mind, the crews and even the planes would rotate in and out. When I say 8, I just mean that 8 were active in that squadron. And they were already preparing to kind of draw down. The war was changing. The last combat mission for Australian Mk.20s would come on May 31st, 1971. And then on June 4, they would fly away from their air base for the final time, arriving home safely the next day. When looking at the total of targets destroyed by the 35th during this time period, 16% were credited to the Australian Air Force. And this actually got quite high acclaim from the American Air Force because, well, they only flew 5 to 6% of the missions. That plus their operational readiness, professionalism, and just ingenuity really did earn them quite a bit. But that was just number 2. Number 6 and number 1 stayed domestic, and actually by 1970-71 they were trading in their Canberras for the F-4 Phantom. That's because already, as this was just going into service in 1954, some in Australia, mainly the penny pinchers in the government, thought it was an old, obsolete plane. But it would go forward. But by 1962, efforts to find its replacement were underway, and in 1963, the F-111, the Aardvark, was selected, and actually I pretty recently did a video on that. And the specific version for Australia was the F-111C. But it's actually a good thing they had the Canberra because, well, that had a lot of delays, and it really wouldn't be available until the mid-70s in any numbers. This is actually why Australia went with the F-4 Phantom. First the D and then later the E variants. Those were interim solutions, stopgaps, because the F-111 was taking so long. The Australians never really wanted the Phantom. It was just something they had to do. But yeah, 71, by that time, number 6 and number 1 were switching over, retiring their Canberras. But number 2 would actually keep flying them for another decade, although no longer in the low-altitude bomber or strike bomber role as we would think of it today. Vietnam and other conflicts had really taught air forces around the world lessons. That plus the introduction of so-called third-generation jets meant that this first generation was just at the end of its service life. Not to mention, several of the Australian Canberras were having stress fractures in the frame, wing, spars, all that. Just aging. They had been flying some of them for 20 years. So, yeah, that's why. Now, Australia actually did operate a total of 58. We had 48 standard production. We had one pre-production or prototype out of Australia. We had the 2 originals from the UK. And then between 58 and 60, at the tail end, we would get 7 more B2s changed into T21s from the UK. I should mention that the final Australian-built version was delivered in September of 1958. So that was the youngest one. So, yeah, and of course with all the hard work and 4 years in Vietnam, yeah, plus the million emergency flights and all that. But what they would do, they would actually fill in the bomb bay with some of these, turning it into a photo reconnaissance or survey aircraft, giving a camera here that leads up to the nose. So it was no longer a bomber. Others were also just used for, jet training and familiarization. And many were used as target towing vehicles. So they would keep on number 2 squad until March of 1982, when they would finally hand in their Canberras. And then the final testing evaluation units that still had a few of these flying would land for the final time in July of that same year. Not bad. 30 years service, or almost. And thus ends the Australian side of this story. And since the whole aircraft was named for that nation, or at least to sit in, I thought this would be a good way to start. Plus, again, this is a new model from Corgi. It was kind of crazy for them to say, hey, we're doing a Canberra, because not only have they not done any of these lately, Corgi's hasn't done a whole lot lately. And that's why, even though I'm not really buying models right now to cover other things, I just couldn't cancel this one since it was made so long ago. And it's neat because I don't have a Canberra with a full bomb layout. By the time I got into 172 scale diecast, the original first release, the 01, was long out of print. I should mention, just because this of course does come with gear down if you prefer to display that way. They're pretty neat too. They have rubber tires that even rotate. So even though you don't get a ton of accessories and you don't really get opening canopy and all that, you at least do get a pilot inside, and then there's a bombardier. And it is very heavy metal. It's over 11 inches each direction. So almost a foot by foot. And Corgi does well with their Commonwealth bombers, even their American bombers. That seems to just be their thing that they do very well. But what do you think? Do you like the Canberra? Do you like kind of this first generation jet bomber? If so, which variant do you like? Again, Martin made quite a few in America as well. I think a lot of people down under kind of lament a day and a time when they still made their own aircraft. They didn't design it, they made it, and they customized it for their needs. But then again, they did the F-111C2, although those were made in America by General Dynamics for them. So yeah. But yeah, if this gets enough views and enough comments, I will do an updated version on the American version and the British. Just let me know. We'll get back to some model stuff later, as the cabin is basically done now. But just between not having anything new and being so busy, it certainly felt like it, guys. I'll just be honest with you. But yeah, let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed it. I definitely wanted to bring this one to you. And again, sorry I couldn't put it on the Speedy thing, but the last thing I want to do is break something. I'm sure I will today at some point anyway, but hopefully not this. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.